Long before empires carved their names into history, the earth itself was writing a different story, in stone and bone. This was a world where survival meant more than strength. It meant the slow, patient art of learning to cooperate. Not just scattered tribes wandering beneath indifferent stars, but the first stirrings of something humanity had never attempted before. What if the roots of civilization stretch back not to golden thrones, but to campfires shared in the long darkness? The ice was retreating then, pulling back like a curtain to reveal valleys that had been frozen for 10,000 years. And in those valleys, our ancestors were about to discover something that would change the human story forever and irreversibly. They were learning to plant seeds in the earth, to wait through seasons, to trust in the future's promise. This was the Neolithic Revolution, though no one alive then could have known they were living through a revolution at all. The wild grasses they gathered became wheat and barley, transformed by human hands into the foundation of settled life. For the first time in our species' long journey, people were choosing to stay in one place through winter and summer alike. Villages appeared where only hunting camps had stood before, mud brick houses rising from the fertile soil like new growth. In the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, something unprecedented was taking root in the ancient earth beneath their feet. Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, where the soil was rich and the water flowed with the promise of abundance. But abundance brought new challenges that our ancestors had never faced in their nomadic lives across the endless plains. How do you divide the harvest when some fields yield more than others and hunger still walks among you? How do you settle disputes when there are no elders who remember how things have always been done before? The first leaders emerged not through violence, but through the ability to organize, to plan, to dream of tomorrow's harvest. They were priests and administrators, keepers of the grain stores and readers of the seasonal stars that guided planting. In the city of Uruk, rising from the Mesopotamian plain, humanity was building something it had never built before this moment. Walls of sun-baked brick enclosed thousands of people living closer together than any human community in all previous history. The first writing appeared on clay tablets, not poetry or prayers, but lists of grain and livestock and debts owed. Stone was being used not just for tools now, but for monuments that would outlast the lives of those who carved them. The ziggurat of Uruk rose like a mountain made by human hands, a stairway reaching toward the heavens themselves above. What were they trying to tell the gods, or perhaps tell themselves, by building such monuments to their collective power? Fire burned in the temple hearths, tended by priests who claimed to speak with the voices of the dead, divine forces of creation. This was no longer the simple life of hunter-gatherers following the herds across grasslands that stretched beyond the horizon's edge. Specialization was emerging. Some grew food, while others crafted tools, wove cloth, or administered the growing complexity of urban existence. Trade routes were being established, connecting distant communities in networks of exchange that spanned hundreds of miles across dangerous terrain. Obsidian from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, all flowing into Mesopotamia's growing cities like tributaries feeding rivers. But with complexity came hierarchy, and with hierarchy came the first true kings who claimed dominion over other human beings. In Egypt, along the life-giving waters of the Nile, another civilization was rising from the desert's edge with its own vision. The river flooded predictably each year, depositing rich black soil that made the valley a ribbon of fertility through endless sand. Here, too, leaders emerged who could organize the labor of thousands, who could envision projects spanning generations beyond their own lives. The first pharaohs united Upper and Lower Egypt around 3,000 years before the birth of Christ in distant Galilee. They were not just kings, but living gods, intermediaries between the mortal world and the eternal realm of divine forces. Stone was their medium of immortality. Limestone and granite carved into temples and tombs that would endure for millennia. The pyramids would rise from the Giza plateau, monuments to the power of organized human labor directed by singular vision. Tens of thousands of workers, not slaves but citizens fulfilling their obligations to the state and the divine order it represented. Each massive stone block was quarried, transported, and lifted into place with nothing but human muscle, rope, and wooden levers. What drives people to undertake such monumental efforts, to pour their lives into projects they will never see completed themselves? Perhaps it was faith, or fear, or the simple human need to build something greater than the span of one lifetime. The Indus Valley civilization was flourishing in the same centuries, though its story would remain hidden for thousands of years beneath earth. Cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro featured sophisticated urban planning, with grid patterns and drainage systems ahead of their time entirely. Yet they left no great monuments to kingship, no pyramids or ziggurats proclaiming the glory of individual rulers above all others. Their writing remains undeciphered, their political structure a mystery, their kings, if they had kings, silent in the archaeological record. What if true civilization requires not grand monuments, but simply the ability to live together in peace and mutual prosperity? In China, along the Yellow River's winding course, the first dynasties were emerging from the mists of legend into historical reality. The Shang dynasty left behind oracle bones, questions carved into turtle shells and ox bones, then cracked with fire to divine answers. They were asking the ancestors about harvests and battles, about the proper days for rituals and the favor of unseen powers. Bronze was being cast into magnificent vessels for ritual offerings, metal transformed by fire into art that still astonishes modern eyes. Across the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to China, from Egypt to the Indus, the pattern was repeating with variations like a theme. Agriculture created surplus. Surplus created specialization. Specialization created hierarchy. And hierarchy created the need for kings to rule over complexity. But kingship brought new questions that humanity had never had to answer in the long ages before cities rose from plains. How much power should one person hold over others? And what gives them the right to command obedience from their fellows? The first law codes were being written, like Hammurabi's code in Babylon, attempting to bring order to the chaos of human interaction. Justice was being formalized, codified, written in stone so that everyone could know the rules that governed their lives together. Not just the rule of the strongest anymore, but the rule of law, however imperfect and harsh those early laws might seem. War was changing too, from raids and skirmishes to organized campaigns with professional soldiers and siege equipment designed for destruction. Empires were expanding, swallowing smaller kingdoms, creating vast territories united under single rulers who claimed divine mandate for their conquest. The Akkadian Empire under Sargon the Great stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, the first true empire in history. Ice had once covered much of the earth, but now it was human ambition that was spreading across the landscape like glaciers. Each conquest brought new peoples under imperial rule, new languages, new gods, new ways of life absorbed into the growing whole. But empires are fragile things, held together by force and faith and the personality of individual rulers who inevitably die. When Sargon died, his empire began to fracture, breaking apart along the fault lines of language and culture and old resentments. The cycle would repeat throughout history, empires rising and falling like waves upon a shore, each one thinking itself eternal. Fire consumed the great cities eventually, whether from invasion or internal collapse, or the simple entropy that claims all human works. The Bronze Age would end in a mysterious collapse around 1200 years before Christ, civilizations falling like dominoes across the Mediterranean. Palaces burned, trade routes were severed, writing systems were forgotten, and the survivors retreated into a dark age of isolation. What caused this collapse remains debated: climate change, invasion, internal rebellion, or perhaps all of these forces converging at once catastrophically. But from the ashes, new kingdoms would eventually rise, learning from the ruins of what came before, building higher on old foundations. The Iron Age brought new technologies, iron weapons and tools that were cheaper and more accessible than bronze had ever been. Empires like Assyria and Persia would grow larger than anything the Bronze Age had seen, stretching across continents with sophisticated administration. The Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great would span from India to Egypt, from the steppes to the sea, united by roads and tolerance. Not just conquest, but the idea that diverse peoples could live together under one rule while maintaining their own customs and beliefs. Stone inscriptions proclaimed the king's achievements in multiple languages, so that all subjects could read of his glory in their own tongue. These were the first empires in the modern sense, bureaucratic machines that could function beyond the lifespan of any single ruler. But even Persia would fall eventually, conquered by Alexander the Great, whose own empire would fracture upon his death at 32 years. Rome was rising in the west, starting as a small city-state that would eventually rule the entire Mediterranean world for centuries. The pattern was ancient by then: agriculture to surplus, to cities, to kingdoms, to empires, each step building on what came before. Yet each civilization thought itself unique, chosen by the gods, destined to rule forever in glory and power over all the earth. The first empires rose not through destiny, but through the hard work of organization, the ability to feed cities and field armies. They rose through writing systems that could record debts and laws, through roads that connected distant provinces, through shared beliefs in divine order. They rose through the willingness of ordinary people to accept hierarchy, to pay taxes, to serve in armies, to build monuments for rulers. What made someone accept a king's authority when for hundreds of thousands of years humans had lived in egalitarian bands without rulers? Perhaps it was the promise of security in an uncertain world, or the appeal of being part of something greater than oneself. Perhaps it was simply that once cities grew large enough, there was no going back to the old ways of wandering. The birth of kings was the birth of civilization as we know it, with all its glories and all its injustices intertwined. Those first empires left us writing and art, law codes and architecture, mathematics and astronomy, the foundations of everything that followed after. But they also left us slavery and warfare, inequality and oppression, the dark shadows that accompany every great human achievement throughout history. The stone monuments still stand in some places, pyramids and ziggurats, and temple ruins rising from desert sands like bones of giants. They remind us that empires are mortal, that even the mightiest kingdoms eventually return to dust beneath the patient weight of time. Fire and ice shape the planet for billions of years before humans ever walked upon its surface beneath ancient skies. But in just a few thousand years, we reshaped ourselves from nomadic hunters into city dwellers, from equals into kings and subjects. The birth of empires was the birth of history itself, the moment when humans began writing down their own story for future ages. We are still living with the consequences of choices made by those first kings and the people who accepted their rule millennia ago. Every government today, every nation and law and border, traces its lineage back to those first experiments in organized human power. Have you ever wondered if we could have chosen a different path? Or was civilization always destined to take this hierarchical form? The Ice Ages are over. The first empires have fallen. But the questions they raised about power and justice remain with us. In the end, the birth of kings was neither purely good nor purely evil, but simply human, a response to the challenges of living together. And somewhere in the ruins of those first great cities, beneath layers of earth and time, lies the story of who we are and how we came to be this way.